Well, good morning. It is good to see all of you. I applaud you for being willing to brave the Arctic chill out there. I don't know about you folks, but I'm a Southern boy, and I don't appreciate the cold one little bit, but here we are, and I'm glad to be here, and I'm certainly glad to have you with me. We're going to be talking about the nature and causes of addiction. I assume you knew that. If you were looking in the wrong place in the program, well, now's your chance to flee. But I hope you don't, because I think this is going to be an interesting class. If you read the class description, you may have noticed that I said that addiction is a plague in America. And I meant that. In fact, addiction has become even more of a plague since the pandemic. I want to share a few pertinent statistics with you. I'm not going to bore you forever on statistics, but in this case, I think they're telling. 5 years ago, I wrote a book on addiction recovery entitled Called to Be Free, which is right there, and which you'll notice is for sale if you are interested. But for this class, I decided, well, it's been 5 years. Maybe I need to check a few government websites and see if my statistics are still any good. And what I found out was that for the most part, things are worse, much worse. The only exception, which I don't understand at all, has to do with alcohol. 5 years ago, there were approximately 18 million alcoholics in America, which they said translated to 1 out of every 12 adults was an alcoholic. Well, now they're saying the number of alcoholics in America has dropped to 14 million, which is 1 out of every 13 adults. Not wonderful, but better. And, you know, I saw that, and I thought, well, how could that be? Could things actually be getting better? Well, as I did more research, I found out, no, that was the only good change that I found. For example, the number of Americans over the age of 12 who use illegal drugs has more than doubled in the last 5 years and is now said to be at 53 million. That's phenomenal, isn't it? Nearly half of Americans say they have a family member or a close friend who either is or has been addicted to drugs. Since the year 2000, more than 1 million Americans have died of a drug overdose. And it's said that today, every 5 minutes, an American dies of a drug overdose. It's kind of hard to wrap your mind around those numbers, isn't it? But I can tell you that this is largely due to the introduction of a synthetic opioid called fentanyl. You've probably heard of it. It's synthetic, it's man-made, and it is said to be at least 50 times as potent as morphine. It doesn't take much to kill. Heroin laced with fentanyl is mostly coming in from Mexico, but any drug can be laced with fentanyl, and it takes only a minute trace of this drug to produce an overdose. It kills because one of the effects of fentanyl is to signal the lungs to stop working. And so you lose consciousness and just die. That's why so many first responders now regularly carry with them a drug called naloxone, which can come as an EpiPen, and it reverses the effects of the fentanyl and causes the addict to regain consciousness. That's the end of the statistics. So you can breathe a sigh of relief. Now, of course, we're here at Sunset, and we're all about the Bible. But as far as I can tell, and I have read the Bible from Genesis to Maps at least once, and I have yet to find the words addict or addiction in the Bible. I guess those words didn't exist back then. But the Bible certainly has some guidance for us on the subject of drunkenness, intoxication, inebriation, whatever you want to call it. In fact, one of the best places is in Proverbs. You may be familiar with Proverbs 23, where King Solomon lampoons the drunkard. And I want to read a few of the verses. We're in Proverbs 23, beginning in verse 31. Do not look at wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup and goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a serpent and stings like an adder. Your eyes will see strange things, and your heart utter perverse things. You will be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea, like one who lies on the top of a mast. They struck me, you will say, but I was not hurt. They beat me, but I did not feel it. When shall I awake? I must have another drink. So we see the drunkard is portrayed as being obsessed with his drinking. You get the impression that he can't wait to come back to consciousness so he can resume his drinking. And again, you get the idea that his life revolves around his addiction. Now, the New Testament has something to say about this as well. In Ephesians 5:18, Paul certainly condemns drunkenness. And he goes even further in 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10 and says, the drunkard will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. But you might ask, what is the problem with inebriation? What's the problem with getting high? Why is it a sin? We see part of the answer in the Gospel of John, chapter 8 and verse 34, where Jesus said, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. I can't think of a better illustration of being a slave to something than addiction. Now, what is the problem with that? Well, I think this gets us to the main point, and that is we were created in the image of God. We were created with a rational mind. We were created with volition, free will. And God condemns any behavior that tends to cloud the mind or inhibit our ability to control ourselves. And of course, all addictive behavior does that. The Proverbs continually extol the virtue of self-control. It's very important. And Paul lists self-control as one of the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians chapter 5, 22 and 23. So let's face it. I think all of us can figure out why self-control is important. Because when you have lost the capacity for self-control, then you make yourself a ready target for Satan and any temptation he might decide to dangle in front of your eyes. We might as well put a bullseye on our back and say, Satan, I'm yours to play with. And I'm sure he will. Because once self-control is lost, we are liable to do or say virtually anything. Things that we would never do while sober. But things that ultimately lead to hurt, either for ourselves, for others, or both. In any case, let me assure you, and I don't think I need to convince you of this, but it is impossible to be godly and be an addict at the same time. The two just don't go together. Now, before we go any further, I think it's probably a good idea that we have a working definition of what I mean when I talk about addiction. Now, over the years, I have gone to a number of different seminars and symposiums, and I've sat at the feet of people from the medical field, and they have presented to the audience some definitions of addiction that are so long and so complicated that it would make your head spin. Well, at least it made my head spin. But I have a definition, and I can't tell you where I came up with this. I probably found it somewhere. I'm not that creative. But I think this is a definition that adequately covers what we're talking about, and it's easy to remember. Addiction is present whenever a person continues to engage in some compulsive behavior despite its obvious harmful consequences. Does that make sense? Let me say that again. I like this definition. Addiction is present whenever a person continues to engage in some compulsive behavior despite its obvious harmful consequences. Now, everyone around the addict can see that he's harming himself. In some cases, they can see he's actually self-destructing. But the addict either can't see it or has ceased to care. Now, this morning, I want to suggest something that may seem like a novel idea, but I think it's very true. Addiction is a multifaceted problem, which requires a multifaceted solution. And we're going to be talking about both of those this morning. But I want to start by saying in most cases, I think that addiction, even though obviously it is a problem, it's not the ultimate problem. In most cases, I think it would be fair to say that addiction is more a symptom than the ultimate problem. And I hope I can convince you of that before I'm done this morning. To understand why addiction is such a problem in America, it requires that we understand the causes, the underlying causes that create an addict in the first place. And I want to suggest that the biggest factor in producing an addict is growing up in an unhealthy home. Now, you may not have seen that coming, but I assure you it's true. I'm not making this stuff up. Most addicts are adult survivors of broken, dysfunctional, and abusive homes. The statistic that I see most often estimates it at about 66%. 2/3 of addicts grew up as abused children or neglected children. One of the courses that I teach at the local prison suggests that the figure is closer to 80%. Now, I'm not in a position to know who's right. I just know we're talking about the vast majority of addicts. So let's talk about these types of families. What is a broken home? Well, a broken home is one where only one parent is present. And this can be the result of many causes. For example, homes where one of the parents is deceased, homes where the parents are separated or divorced, homes where one of the parents has abandoned the family, homes where the parents never married and the father has never been around if his identity is even known, homes where one of the parents is rarely at home because of work, homes where one of the parents is incarcerated, or homes where the children have been taken from the custody of their parents and placed in a foster home or a children's home. I think we all understand that in most cases where only one parent is present, it's the father who's missing. And there was a time when people thought, well, that's not that big a deal. Men just aren't that important. But decades of research has shown that that is highly naive and not at all true. That they have found that when children grow up without their father present, the results are not pretty. These are the kids most likely to grow up in poverty. These are the kids most likely to be abused by some adult. These are the kids most likely to have mental and emotional problems. These are the kids most likely to do poorly in school. These are the kids most likely to drop out of high school. These are the kids most likely to join a gang. The kids most likely to engage in criminal behavior. The ones most likely to wind up in the penitentiary. In fact, it's estimated that 70% of Americans serving long-term sentences in prison grew up without their father. These are also the kids most likely to use drugs and alcohol, and they're the kids most likely to run away from home, wind up homeless, think about committing suicide, or actually commit suicide. And unfortunately, it's estimated that somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of our kids are going to grow up without their dad. And so I want to suggest from a sociological perspective, this is a recipe for disaster. Now, dysfunctional families are another form of unhealthy family. A dysfunctional family is a family where one or both parents are present, but which are unhealthy. That's really what dysfunctional means. The family is unhealthy in any number of ways. For example, one or both of the parents is an addict. One or both of the parents is engaged in criminal behavior. One or both of the parents is mentally ill. One or both of the parents is abusive to other family members. One or both of the parents has some very big issues from their own family of origin, issues, baggage that has never been dealt with and which is rearing its ugly head in the present family. And the problem is that unresolved hurt does that. It doesn't just go away with time. And if we don't deal with it, that hurt is going to continue to affect the present. And if you have your own family, it's going to spill over into your current family. Now, the common denominator in dysfunctional families is that one or both parents are failing to function in the manner that God intended. Now, that's just pretty obvious. That's the bottom line. And unfortunately, broken and dysfunctional homes oftentimes are breeding grounds for child abuse and neglect. So let's talk about that for a minute. Sexual abuse occurs when a child is treated as an object of the abuser's sexual gratification. It is said that sexual abuse probably does the most damage of any of the forms that we'll talk about. It includes anything from fondling to penetration by anything. And the fact of the matter is, it can involve any type of sexual behavior that the human mind is capable of coming up with. And in all cases of sexual abuse, children are introduced to sexual feelings, sexual emotions, and sexual behavior that they are not emotionally equipped to deal with. Physical abuse occurs when a child is subjected to what the Constitution calls cruel and unusual punishment. This can include anything that results in injury, such as broken bones, bleeding, welts, bruises, burns. I think it also occurs anytime a child is subjected to any form of punishment that is not appropriate for the age of the child and is beyond the child's capacity to understand why he or she is being punished. There's also verbal abuse. Now, verbal abuse most commonly is insulting, demeaning speech, whether or not the abuser uses profanity. But it can come in a lot of other forms, one of which, funny enough, is the silent treatment. That is a form of verbal abuse. But probably the worst form of all is where the parent lets the child know that the child's very existence is displeasing to the parent. That's when a parent says things like, I wish you'd never been born, or I should have had an abortion. And believe it or not, in my prison ministry, I have run into two different inmates who confided in me after class that their moms had said that to them. And here it was decades later, and it still haunted them. Time had healed nothing. There's also emotional abuse, and emotional abuse is present when any other form of abuse occurs, but it can also occur by itself. For example, when a parent is a tyrant, it's sort of a parent who parents with the idea that it's my way or the highway. And by doing that, the parent lets everyone else in the family know that your needs, your desires, your opinions, your wants are unimportant. We're doing it my way. Emotional abuse certainly happens if your parent tends to be a rageaholic. Or it can happen when a parent has huge, unpredictable mood swings. And so being at home is like being on a minefield. And the children have to become experts at reading the signs to know whether it's safe to come home from school today. One of the worst ones is when a parent plays favorites with the children. It damages everyone, including the favorite. Now, I was the victim of emotional abuse, but in a very unusual way. I've never seen this one described in any book that I've ever read on child abuse. When I was 5, my family moved from one state to another. And I guess I should say I was fortunate that they took me, but they abandoned everything that belonged to me, everything that meant anything to me. I mean, I'm talking about things like my bike, my wagon, my train set, all my Tonka toys, all my games. What message does that give you? Well, I must not be all that important. That's why my stuff is not important. As a parent myself, I still can't figure that one out. It just blows my mind. Now, there's also neglect. And neglect in one form or another is also present when any other form of abuse is occurring. And it occurs when a child's normal, legitimate needs for maintenance, nurturance, and guidance aren't met. Now, neglect was what mostly characterized my family. They weren't abusive in all the typical ways that you think about when you hear about child abuse. For example, my father. Well, he wasn't there very often. And even when he was there, he wasn't there emotionally. He never showed much interest in me. He never showed much interest in getting to know me or do anything with me. I don't recall him ever trying to teach me anything or give me guidance on anything. My mom was there, but she wasn't much better. Even though she had a college degree, it would appear that she knew virtually nothing about how to be a mother. I thought those things just kind of came naturally, but apparently it doesn't always. She didn't know how to nurture, and she was one of these people who very rarely showed any kind of affection. The thing that I remember the most is that in all the years that I lived in their house, not once did I ever get praised for anything, no matter what I did. Now, I have a child. I praise her all the time. I'm not going to do to her what was done to me. But let me give you the most egregious example of what I'm talking about, so you know I'm not exaggerating. This happened when I was graduating from college. There was like a week in between when I finished exams and when there was going to be the graduation ceremonies. During this single week, 3 incredible things happened to me. I found out I was going to graduate with honors. I found out I'd been tapped into a National Honor Society, and I'd been accepted by the graduate school of my choice. Well, you know, this was like the ultimate dream come true. It was the greatest natural high I had ever experienced. I was bouncing off the walls. I was so happy. I couldn't wait to share my good news. But I made the mistake of calling home. And when I called home, my mother answered, and I ran through the whole thing of what had happened. And certainly she could hear the excitement in my voice. Her only response was, "That's nice," said in a monotone. No praise, no validation, no sharing my joy. When I hung up the phone, I was stunned. I really was in a state of shock. That was so over the top, even of their behavior in the past. Now I have to say, sometimes the neglect even extended to medical needs. Here's another one I'll never forget. I was about 8 or 9, and it was spring or summer, and I was wearing shorts, and I was walking through the woods that adjoined our little neighborhood. And unfortunately, I stepped into a ground nest of bees or hornets. Well, at that time, I didn't even know there were ground nests of those things. I thought they had hives hanging from trees. But in any event, I stepped into a pile of leaves, and I felt something weird, and I looked down at my legs, and I couldn't see skin. All I saw were bees. I screamed bloody murder and went tearing home. And when I got home, I told Mom what happened. And she acted like she didn't believe me, or that it didn't concern her in the slightest. She said, "Well, if you're not feeling well, why don't you just go lie down for a while? Dinner will be ready in an hour." Now that I'm an adult, I'm thinking, had this woman never heard of anaphylactic shock? I mean, I could have died. Fortunately, I wasn't very allergic to the venom in me, but I have to admit, I did hallucinate for about an hour from all the venom that was in my system. Crazy. Well, that's enough of child abuse. Let's talk about the consequences of it. Children are born with a need to feel loved, to feel valued, and to feel safe. Would you all agree with that? That's pretty basic. But when these fundamental needs aren't met because of either child abuse and or neglect, the consequences are tragic and quite profound. The child gets the constant message, whether subtle or not so subtle, that, well, you're just not that important. You're not worth our attention or our time or our affection. In cases of child abuse, you're not even worth our protection. And so, as you can imagine, this does terrible things to a child's normal sense of self-worth. Normal, legitimate feelings of self-worth just kind of crash and burn, leaving the child at the core of his being feeling like there's something wrong with me. He doesn't feel good about himself in his inner self. He feels insecure. He feels inferior. He feels like he doesn't fit in. He lacks self-confidence. He doesn't really know how to handle conflict. He finds it difficult to assert himself in any case. He's uncomfortable around other people. Typically finds it difficult to handle criticism. He definitely finds it difficult to trust other people. And for that reason, he finds it difficult to ever have intimate relationships with other people. He's afraid to let people get close because people are dangerous. Somewhere I read this and I thought it was so profound, and it certainly described me. They said that a child who was abused or neglected grows up biologically, physically, but inside they still feel like a child trapped in an adult's body. And that's because all the needs that the child had were never met. And so that child is still alive and well and has not grown up. And so now the abused child is a broken, hurting adult who oftentimes lacks the skills in order to cope and succeed in this world. And one of the tragic effects is spiritual. You know, we know that parents are supposed to model God for their kids, but in these unhealthy homes, that either doesn't happen at all or it happens very badly, very poorly. And so the children wind up with very warped views of God if they believe in God at all. They may not even know about God because the parents may not have bothered to include any kind of religious instruction at all. But those who were victims of child abuse typically reason kind of along these lines: God couldn't possibly exist, or if he does, he couldn't be very good. And even if he's basically benevolent, he's probably not very powerful. Or even if he does have some power, apparently he doesn't care anything about me. I mean, after all, where was he when I was being abused? Why didn't he make it stop? Why did he abandon me? Or at the other end of the spectrum, the child may have had some religious instruction, may believe in God, but typically they fear God the same way they feared their abuser. Concepts like love, grace, and mercy are totally foreign to them because they never experienced it. And because of their feelings of unworthiness, they tend to be very legalistic, feeling like they've got to work as hard as they can to mollify God and somehow earn his favor. Well, unfortunately, the adult survivor of child abuse oftentimes tries to cope in any number of sinful, dysfunctional, and self-destructive ways, which usually include some form of addiction. Addiction can involve either substance abuse or some sort of behavioral addiction. Substance abuse, of course, includes alcohol and drugs, whether we're talking illegal street drugs or the abuse of prescription medications. Behavioral addictions include all manner of things: sex, pornography, gambling, eating disorders, self-harm like cutting, any number of compulsive behaviors, which can even include video games and what they call social media. Now, I might mention, about a year ago, Netflix produced their own documentary about social media, and it was called Our Social Dilemma. And it was fascinating because they interviewed tons of industry insiders, and they all very candidly admitted all social media is designed to be addictive. So if you find you can't put Facebook down, there's a reason for it. They've got algorithms in place that are designed to hook you like a fish. Now, the most common addiction, at least in America, is probably sugar, but that's a discussion for another day. That certainly affects those who have eating disorders, though. But what we need to understand is that the addict is attempting to self-medicate, whether or not the addict understands that, and usually they don't. Engaging in the addiction of choice is often the only time they feel good about themselves. It's the only time they have some measure of self-confidence. They have the courage to assert themselves. And oftentimes, they feel, while they're under the influence anyway, that they're very funny, clever, witty, the so-called life of the party, regardless of how foolish they may appear to everybody else around them. But what I'm trying to get across is that their addiction is their number one coping mechanism. It's how they get through life. So we need to see that addictive behavior is being driven by a whole host of mental and emotional problems. Remember I said addiction is kind of more the symptom? Underlying it are all sorts of problems like fear, anxiety, depression, deep-seated feelings of rage and shame, maybe even thoughts of suicide or suicide attempts. And as I said earlier, these issues don't just go away with time. They have a tendency to keep influencing the present until we do something about it. And unfortunately, while the addict is self-medicating, his addiction is solving nothing. It's just making matters worse. And oftentimes, once he comes down, the addict is saddled with all sorts of unpleasant feelings like self-condemnation, self-loathing, and despair. Well, we've talked a lot about the causes of addiction. Why don't we spend a little bit of time talking about how addiction actually works? The National Institute on Drug Abuse tells us that the number one culprit when it comes to addiction is a brain chemical called dopamine. Now, I see a number of people nodding their heads. Yes, I've heard of dopamine. As well you should. Dopamine is the brain chemical of pleasure and reward. It's dopamine that produces the high, the rush, that feeling of euphoria that the addict craves. In fact, the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse says that it's really the dopamine we're addicted to. We engage in the addictive behavior to get us the dopamine. Now, any chemical or addictive behavior becomes addictive because it causes abnormal amounts of dopamine to be present in the brain and to be there for abnormal lengths of time. So, abnormal amounts for an abnormal length of time. And this state of affairs can happen in one of three ways, depending on, for example, what drug you're using. Drugs like amphetamine or methamphetamine, they signal brain cells to flood the brain with dopamine. On the other hand, drugs like alcohol and opiates suppress the brain cells that normally inhibit the release of dopamine. And drugs like cocaine suppress the brain cells that control the reuptake or the reabsorption of the dopamine. But regardless of how it works, it produces the same result. You wind up with the same effect. You have abnormal amounts of dopamine flowing through your brain for abnormal lengths of time. And the result of that is you experience pleasure to a degree and intensity that is abnormal. That is far beyond anything you can feel in any other way. In fact, you could say you are feeling better than God ever designed you to feel. Now, whether or not you're a candidate for addiction has to do with the other side of the coin, which is the number of dopamine receptors in your brain. Now, if you have too few dopamine receptors, then when you engage in behavior or take drugs that can be addictive, typically they don't do anything for you. And you're wondering, what's all the fuss about? This didn't do a thing for me. I suspect these are the people that engage in what's oftentimes called extreme sports. You know, people who like to rock climb and bungee jump and go skydiving. In other words, it takes something pretty extreme to get their dopamine system to kick in. And I think that's the attraction. I may be wrong, but I'll give you that for free. Now, if you have too many dopamine receptors, then your brain gets overstimulated, and what you feel is downright unpleasant and may actually be experienced as painful. And so you're left wondering, why would anyone in their right mind do that to themselves? But if the number of dopamine receptors in your brain is within the right range, then you're going to feel pleasure unlike anything you've ever felt before. It's kind of like Goldilocks. You remember Goldilocks and the Three Bears? The number of your dopamine receptors is neither too big nor too small. It's just right. You're in the right range. Now, I said that addictive behavior causes you to feel pleasure unlike you ever felt before. And of course, it's so good that in many people, they can't wait to experience it again and again and again. There's a problem, though. The brain recognizes that this is an abnormal state of affairs. And so, over time, the brain responds by reducing the amount of dopamine that's released and shutting down dopamine receptors. And this produces what we call tolerance, which means you have to try to use more and more and more, trying to replicate that first experience. The problem is, it'll never happen, because you will never again have the same amount of dopamine flowing through your brain with the same number of dopamine receptors ready to receive it and process it. Now, that's not to say it doesn't still feel good. It feels good enough to keep you using or acting out, but you just can't replicate that first virgin high. And unfortunately, if you do this long enough, you can get to the point where there's no reward at all. In fact, you have to keep doing it just to try to feel normal. And that's because you have damaged your brain. Specifically, you have blunted your brain's ability to produce and process dopamine at all. So you're left in a horrible state of affairs where nothing produces pleasure. Nothing artificial, nothing natural. I use this illustration. It's kind of like one morning you had a 75-inch 4K ultra high definition TV with surround sound. But after you used too much, it's like somebody repossessed it and left you with a 19-inch black and white TV with only one crummy little speaker inside. All of a sudden, life is blah. It's black and white. There's no Technicolor anymore. But this doesn't exhaust your addiction's effects on the brain. While you're using or acting out, you can't think rationally about your addiction. And that's because while you are engaging in addictive behavior, it tends to short-circuit the frontal cortex of your brain, which is the seat of rational thought and impulse control. That's why you can't think rationally about what you're doing to yourself, and that's why you wind up doing things you'd never do while you're sober. Now, another unfortunate effect of addiction on the brain is what's called euphoric recall, which is a form of selective memory. You know, for example, something awful might have happened while you were using, and so for a brief time you're thinking about quitting. Well, you better act on it pretty quickly, because if you don't, your brain will sabotage you with euphoric recall. And that is, you start thinking more and more and focusing on all the good stuff that you associate with your addiction. How good you feel when you're high, the fun you have when you're with your drinking buddies or the people you do drugs with. And you conveniently ignore all the bad stuff. You know, how bad you felt the next morning. How embarrassed you were when you found out what you had done the night before. And so this is one reason why addiction is hard to break. But euphoric recall isn't the only reason why it's hard to break. Probably the main reason is that the addict can't imagine life without his addiction of choice. I mean, it's his number one coping mechanism. It's how he self-medicates the pain of his past. It's how he copes with all the stressors of life. And of course, this is also compounded by the phenomenon we call denial, where because the addict isn't thinking rationally, he denies he's an addict to begin with. Maybe it's a question of pride. We don't want to believe that we've lost control and that we're no longer captains of ourselves. The constant mantra of the addict is, "I can quit anytime." I'm sure you've probably heard that. Now, at this juncture, you might be thinking, well, for crying out loud, maybe it's true, once an addict, always an addict. Well, I'm not going to kid you. Addiction is not easy to break, but it can be done. And we're going to talk about that. What has to happen for an addict to change? Well, it's well known in the recovery community that an addict has to hit bottom. And hitting bottom just depends on the person. I've known people who hit bottom the first time they were arrested for driving while intoxicated. Other people are a little more committed to their addiction, and it takes something more drastic, like losing their job or their family or their freedom. But something has to happen that causes the addict to have what we call a moment of clarity, when for maybe the first time in years the fog lifts and he's sick and tired of being sick and tired. He realizes that he's got to stop before things get worse. It's gotten to the point where the pain of change is less than the pain of staying the same. Now, when that moment of clarity comes, something else happens. It's called a window of opportunity. He has a moment of time when he literally has to do something to pursue his sobriety, or else euphoric recall will happen. Or, if he doesn't act quickly enough, let's face it, life doesn't change, and life is still full of stress and disappointment and frustration. And so, if he has not made the firm decision to get sober, he's in danger of relapsing when life hits him upside the head, with another disappointment. Now, we've talked about the many facets of addiction, the nature of the problem. Now we have a few brief minutes, I'm afraid to say. What time is it? Yeah, I don't have much time. Got a few moments to talk about the multifaceted solution. And the first step is getting involved with a support group. That probably doesn't surprise anybody. It's not good for an addict to be alone. Typically, when an addict is alone, they start nursing all sorts of negative thoughts and resentments and think about everybody who's ever done them wrong. They need some support. They need to be around people who make them feel comfortable, who make them feel like they're understood and that they're not pathetic freaks. If his religious background is some form of Christianity, the addict would be well advised to find a support group that meets in a church, because there, rather than a secular group, he'll be able to talk about his faith in Christ, and he probably won't leave smelling like a used ashtray, because usually they don't smoke at church, and profanity is usually discouraged or prohibited entirely. Secondly, besides the support group, because of the nature of the problem, I urge addicts to get into counseling. There are all sorts of underlying issues that are driving this addiction, and usually only a professional counselor can get to the heart of the matter, help them to see what was done to them, what the effect of it was, and help them process the emotions that they produced. And if you can't afford a counselor, usually you can call 211, and that number will give you a list of community resources, including mental health resources in your area. The third facet involves another form of professional help, and that is a psychiatrist or a medical doctor, someone who can prescribe legitimate medication so that you don't have to self-medicate anymore. Because a lot of addicts are suffering from things like anxiety, depression, maybe even something like bipolar disease. Well, they need legitimate medication for it. And obviously, what they've been using in the past didn't work. And it's a lot easier to avoid relapse if you're properly medicated and your brain chemistry is on an even keel. But then the fourth facet is what we in this room know all about. It's Christianity. It's the church. We Christians know that God wants us to seek Him. He wants to save us. We know God wants to deliver us from our sins, not in our sins. And I think we all need to understand God is still in the transformation business. And to do this, God has left 4 resources for us. First and foremost, there's the Bible. That's where we find out about God and spiritual reality. That's where we meet Jesus and the gospel and find out what we must do to be saved. There's also prayer. God tells us, pray continually. He wants to hear from us. Pray about your addiction. Pray for deliverance from your addiction. Third is the Holy Spirit. When you obey the gospel, you're indwelt by the very Spirit of God. He's there to help. He's there to intercede when we pray. He's there to help create His fruit in us, the character traits of Christ Himself. He is God's active agent in transformation. But there's also the church. And this is something we shouldn't downplay. The recovering addict needs a new community. He needs people. We all need people. And we need positive people, supportive people, encouraging people. Not the people he's been running with. And so, if the addict is going to have a real chance of being happy and contented, he needs to find a home in a church. Because the fact of the matter is, happiness is the number one cure for addiction. Happy people don't become addicts in the first place. So, I think nothing could be more effective, nothing could be more helpful to the addict than being introduced to Christ and His church. And if you leave here having learned nothing else this morning, I'd like you to hold on to these 4 truths. God still loves broken, hurting people, including addicts. The gospel still has the power to transform human beings, including addicts. Broken, hurting people desperately need what only we in the church have. And we in the church need them as well if we are to be salt and light and to be about the Lord's business of expanding the borders of His kingdom. Well, I appreciate so much your being here. I appreciate your being attentive. And I'm sorry I went all the way to the end of my time, but...
Can you take a minute of a couple questions?
I'll try, unless somebody wants to cut me off.
A young lady, and she grew up in a household where her father was homosexual, and she was having all kinds of issues with her family. Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering if you'd give some recommendation to the church, to what the church can do besides maybe what you've already given.
That is a toughie. That is a real toughie. When I was preaching in Bryan, we had a family where the father was a homosexual, and the mother took matters into her hands and divorced him. And that's usually what happens, regardless of what the church has to say. And I don't think there are many elders anymore that would insist that a woman remain married to a homosexual.
Well, it did damage to this young lady. I mean, here she is. She's seen all this stuff. She's familiar with it.
How old is she?
Oh, she might have been 18 or 19, right out of high school.
Okay, well, she would definitely benefit from counseling. And yeah, she can counsel with the ministry staff or the eldership, but I would urge her to get professional counseling because she was subjected to trauma. There's no question about it.
Is your recommendation for dealing with smoking and drinking then, you've given us some things in here, but I was just wondering, we have several people in the church that are having that type of an issue. What would you recommend for the church to do practically to help develop a support group or something like
Well, that is a very lengthy topic.
Right.
If you go on, do you have the Sunset Library app on your phone?
I'm sure I can get one.
Well, get one because I did an entire class on how a church can start its own support ministry.